Good afternoon. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIKS. I'm Yonho Kim, Associate Director at GWIKS. And thank you for joining our GWIKS interview series. We have launched this program for interviewing prominent GW alumni working in the policy fields. And our first interviewee is Wendy Cutler, a Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. As a former top U.S. trade negotiator, Wendy will provide her views on the new challenges for trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region, and she will also share her experiences at GW and provide career advice to students. Let me briefly introduce her. Wendy is Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and she also serves as the Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office. She joined the Asia Society Policy Institute following an illustrious career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Most recently, she served as acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative, working on a range of U.S. trade negotiations and initiatives in the Asia-Pacific region. And in that capacity, she was responsible for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP agreement, including the bilateral negotiations with Japan. And she also was the chief negotiator to the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, or KORUS of FTA. Good afternoon, Wendy.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I didn't realize I was going to be the inaugural guest for your new program of interviewing GW alumni, so I'm really honored to join you this afternoon.
Yeah, so it's also our honor to have you for today's interview. So welcome back to your alma mater. How did you find your GW undergraduate experience? What made it so rewarding to you?
Well, I really enjoyed my 4 years at the George Washington University. I think going to school in Washington, D.C. really offers unmatched opportunities for college students. And we'll get into this, but I really encourage students at GW to take advantage of being in Washington, whether that means getting internships, or going to, lectures by policymakers, and just getting to know the city. But I found my experience just extremely interesting and useful. When I first came to GW, I wanted to be a political science major, and I was very interested in American history and in American political science. But within 1 semester, I changed to international. I had a great professor, and the international side was so interesting, and there were so many opportunities I'd never known about. And so, again, another set of advice I have for students at GW, or any students, is just to be really open to new opportunities, and don't think that you know what you want to do all the time. It's okay to change your interest and to grow and to try out new things.
Right. I mean, I totally agree with you that Washington is a great place to both work and study, and you have a lot of opportunities as a student even to interact and network with the professionals and also the scholars in Washington. Because this question might be the number one question student wants to ask you. How did your GW experience lead you to the next step in your education and your career? Can you give us a little bit more stories about that?
Sure. So I mentioned I quickly moved into the international side. Now, I'm not going to tell you what year I graduated. You can look it up, but I don't want to mention that. But in those years, if you were doing international, you wanted to work with Russia, at that time called the Soviet Union. So GW had an excellent program in Soviet studies then. I went into that program. I got a great internship working at the Department of the Interior in the Fish and Wildlife Service, working on a program with US and Russian scientists. And that was my first job leaving GW. And I loved this job, but then within a couple of years, the détente arrangement we had with the Soviet Union ended, And I realized there wasn't really a future in US-Russia relations unless you wanted to kind of work in the intelligence area or the military area. So I decided I better go back to school. This time I didn't pick GW, I went to Georgetown. And then going to Georgetown, I wanted a broader international education. I wanted to focus in economics and trade, and that's what I did. And when I left Georgetown, I joined the government again as a presidential management fellow. And that's how I started in the US government, and I stayed there for over 30 years.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was a big decision to make to be, focused on this trade issues. And what made you decide to pursue your career as a both diplomat and trade negotiator? That sounds really interesting and exciting.
Yeah, when I decided to go into the trade field, it wasn't as popular as it is now. It was a real niche area, but it was of great interest to me. I wanted a job where I could travel internationally. It seemed like it was a job that there was a lot of opportunities, including opportunities for women. And it was a job where there were so many different countries you could work with and different issues and different sectors you could focus on. So it wasn't really boring. You weren't like a specialist to the point where you couldn't do anything else. And I always felt through my career that my job was changing. I was working on a different negotiation, which is, in many ways, you brought the same skills to each negotiation, but each negotiation was completely different. And I felt like I was learning all the time. And for me, that was important in my career.
Another big question students would have for you is this. What would you recommend to a college student who is interested in a similar career path as yours? So what course of action should be taken to minimize trial and error?
Well, first, I don't think trial and error is so bad. That's kind of what I did, and it worked for me. Because for me, that means getting out of your comfort zone. Don't get just so focused, this is what I want to do. If you remain open and you find yourself going to lectures or taking classes in subjects that you didn't think were of great interest, you'd be amazed how a career path can change by just having a great professor or finding a great internship. Or working with colleagues that are interested in an area that you never really thought of. So first, I would just encourage all students, just keep your options open, look for opportunities, get out of your comfort zone. And my second recommendation would be just take advantage of being in Washington, D.C., because I think from a career perspective, it gives you an edge up on a lot of competing students in other colleges and universities that don't have the same opportunities that Washington, D.C. provides. And finally, I just want to mention that throughout my whole career, I've run into many alumni from GW, and I stay in touch with some students I went to school with. And so you really have the opportunity to develop a real network of colleagues that through your career, you may end up working with, you may just run into them. Sometimes, your colleagues can help you find your next job or suggest, different career options you never thought about. So again, just keeping your options open and remaining curious and intellectually engaged.
So we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, and it has revealed the economic vulnerabilities of the nations in the region. And do you think reshoring could be part of the solution?
Well, I think reshoring is going to be part of the solution, and not just for the United States. I find it quite interesting that many other countries are looking at reshoring, partially as a result of COVID, particularly focused in the medical area, whether it be medical equipment, PPE, or medicines, but it's broader than that as well. I think what COVID showed was vulnerabilities in supply chains, and particularly in goods deemed essential or strategic, a recognition that maybe we become over-reliant on China or other sources for inputs and for needed equipment. And I was just reading this weekend, I think that even South Korea is looking at reshoring or providing tax and other incentives to bring their companies home as well. But reshoring, at the end of the day, that's a decision that companies make. They look at the costs, they look at the revenues, they look at a lot of factors, including incentives that their governments might provide, including their desire to reduce their vulnerabilities. And so it's an important decision to make, and not one that is made lightly. I think governments have an important role to play, and they can provide incentives, such as tax incentives or subsidies or some other kind of payments. But I also think it's important that trade isn't used as a tool, or protectionism isn't used as a tool to try and reshore jobs. I prefer that an incentive approach be followed versus putting up tariff walls, to force our companies one way or another to come home.
We have been seeing an intensifying strategic competition between the US and China over the last couple of years. So how do you think a US trade policy should address the economic challenges by China?
Yeah, I mean, looking ahead, China is going to be the topic anyone in international affairs will be working on for their lifetime. I look back in my career at GW, and 30 so years ago, or a little more than that, it looked like everything was going to be about the Soviet Union. But now it's China, China, China. And there are enormous challenges, not only in the economic field, but with respect to geostrategic issues, people-to-people issues, technology issues, that are really going to present challenges and are going to result in tensions between the two largest economies. One thing that I have learned just watching both the tools that the Trump administration has used to try and pry open the Chinese market, as well as previous approaches used by administrations I work for, is that there's no silver bullet here. There's no one thing that we can do that's going to get everything back on track with China. So I think looking ahead, a multifaceted approach really needs to be followed. One that, in my view, needs to be very focused on working with allies and partners collectively to approach China in a united way. But I also think there's room for bilateral negotiations. There's room for working in existing international organizations, and there may be a need for new international organizations. I think there's even room for unilateral measures. I don't particularly like them, but I get it that there are instances where unilateral actions have been and may be needed again in the future. So again, I think looking ahead, we really need to look at a handful of policy tools, but the key will be to really know what we're using these tools to accomplish. What's our objective? Where do we want to be? What's our strategy? And sometimes, at least in recent years, I feel like in some ways the actions are almost they become the ends, not a means to an end, but the end themselves. And so I think we need to take a step back and figure out, what do we want to achieve? What type of relationship we want with China? Where are there areas where we can collaborate? Are there areas where we're going to compete? And are there areas, where confrontation is inevitable? And I would also just say that part of any trade policy or technology policy towards China really needs to be accompanied by strong domestic competitiveness measures at home, whether it be more expenditures on infrastructure, R&D, innovation, education, as well as worker adjustment. I think we need to really get our domestic act together if we're going to be able to compete with China in the decades ahead.
Thank you. And let's narrow it down to the Korea issues. So South Korea's economic interdependence with China has dramatically risen, and some people, especially in Washington, are worried about its potential impact on the US-ROC alliance. What elements of the trade policy do you think should be strengthened by Washington, both Washington and Seoul, to maintain the resilience of the alliance?
Mm-hmm. South Korea is very dependent upon China for trade. I think 25% of its exports go to China. And let's remember, China's I think the only advanced economy that's going to be in the positive space this year during COVID, and it's going to grow a lot quicker than the United States next year as well, according to IMF forecasts. So I understand that probably Korea feels like it's in a tough place between the United States and China. On one hand, it's an important ally of the United States, but economically, in many ways, it has very deep ties with China. So Korea is going to need to carefully navigate between two superpowers, and that's never easy. And Korea's learned the hard way a few years ago when they agreed to install the THAAD missiles, and they had to suffer through, Chinese informal retaliation. But all that said, I think there is space for the United States and Korea, along with others, to work collectively to get China to abandon its trade distorting and unfair trade practices. Again, the United States tried to do this alone. It's not working. The US is working closely with the EU and Japan, but I think that net needs to be expanded, and Korea is a logical partner. I also think that when it comes to the World Trade Organization and WTO reform, Korea, a country that's benefited enormously from the multilateral trading system, I think can play a very important role in pushing for reform. And I'm delighted to see that the Korean trade minister is one of the two finalists for the next position for the Director General of the World Trade Organization. I think that's a real testament, not only to her personally, and she's a good friend of mine, but to Korea as a country. I mean, it is a country that has benefited from trade, but I think it can play a really important role in helping the World Trade Organization and the rules-based systems stay intact and modernize and really address the challenges of this century.
So I understand you have been very much committed to women's empowerment in the trade field specifically. So can you briefly discuss why this is important?
Yeah, and this is an issue I kind of stumbled upon negotiating trade agreements in Asia, including in Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. And that is, through my career, I noticed when I looked across the table that I was mostly negotiating against men. There were very few women on the, sitting across the table from me. I met the current Korean trade minister, Minister Yu, during the chorus negotiations now about 13 years ago. She was one of the few women who were on the Korean delegation. And as I negotiated, a lot of younger women would come up to me during my trips to Seoul or Tokyo or elsewhere and just tell me that, it's basically say, you're my role model. When I look and I look at our delegations, they're all men, and it's so great seeing a country like the United States that has a woman at the helm of these negotiations. And as a result, I developed, just strong feelings and wanting to give back and wanting to mentor and help women in Asia really advance in their careers in the international trade area. And I'm heartened to see that so many women are joining the ranks, both in government and in the private sector, in the trade field in Asia. But one thing that I've learned is that since they're kind of the first generation joining, they have very few women to turn to for mentoring, for advice, and just trying to talk to understand how to confront certain issues. One issue, just of key, that applies, I think, to all women in the workforce, including in the trade field where you need to travel a lot, is how to balance your work demands with your family demands, that work-life balance. And I know in countries like Korea and Japan, it's even more difficult because the expectations for women in terms of what they're supposed to do at home with respect to children and the chores is a lot more substantial and extensive than in the United States. But these are challenges that all women face. And what I'd like to tell these younger women is there's no answer here. There's no magic bullet. I can't tell you that I've even learned how to do that. There are certain days I would tell these women, certain days I felt like I disappointed my family, and other days I felt like I disappointed my boss. But there were very few days where I felt like I was doing a good job across the board. So I'm very passionate about this. I have a program underway with Korean women specifically, and I'm very excited about bringing another group of Korean women here to the United States under this program once the COVID restrictions allow for travel again.
What are the skill sets did you find really important for trade negotiators? And for students, how can they start hone that kind of specific skill sets?
Well, it's a great question. People ask me that. And the first thing I admit is I never took a class in trade negotiations or just negotiating. And I've learned now that in colleges and universities now, they do offer those classes. So my first recommendation would be, if you think you're interested, take one of those classes, because it's a good way to learn in school. For me, I learned by watching other people negotiate. And then I learned trial by fire, where I made some mistakes. I succeeded sometimes, but I kind of learned in person at the negotiating table. Negotiating, I think, is a combination of some common sense skills, but also things that you can do to really, advance your ability to reach deals with other countries. And those would include things like being a problem solver. In other words, you can't go to a negotiating table every week, every few months, and just keep repeating the same position. At some point, and the other side repeats their position. At some point, unless you decide to cut off the talks, you're going to need to work to find common ground. And so even if you're not going to put a bridging proposal on the table at a certain instance, I always found myself kind of thinking about what are my counterparts saying, what's important to them, what's their concerns, and then knowing my concerns, how can we bridge those differences? And I think that's a very important skill. I also would underscore the need of being just very well prepared for negotiations is important. And that doesn't just mean knowing your proposal you're putting on the table and your ability to walk through it and understand every nook and cranny about it, but it's really anticipating the other side's response, being prepared to answer their questions, understanding the political pressures and other pressures your counterpart may be facing, and really understanding the political climate of the country you're negotiating with. And so I think being just up on all that information is very important to make you an effective negotiator. And I would say for women, I think it's even more important, because men love testing women at the negotiating table to see if they can break them or to show that they're not as smart as the guy. And so I would just urge all women in particular, if you choose a path like this, spend a lot of time before each negotiating session and really learn your stuff. And I would also just underscore that the ability to listen is very important. I think it's a way to accord respect to the other side, but I also think it helps you bridge differences with the other side if you're really tuning in to what they say and you're really trying to understand what's important to them and what challenges they are facing. And finally, I would just say patience is very important. You mentioned at the beginning, I worked on the TPP negotiations. Those took 5 years. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, I understand, are going to be concluded with signature next month in Vietnam. Those negotiations have been underway for 8 years. And so if you're an impatient person, this is not the profession to go into. You need to really kind of calibrate your time and recognize that these are endeavors where you need to make a commitment, and there'll be a lot of ups and downs, and maybe a negotiation won't come to closure, but impatience isn't going to help you get to the finish line. I'm not the most patient person, but in my daily life, but at the negotiating table, I can outlast anyone.
Do you happen to know of any pathways into the UN besides the Young Professional Program, as well as their internship programs? Furthermore, would you recommend that students build up experiences by working for NGOs or think tanks first before entering the UN or entering the government side, I should say?
I think patience is really important in working for international organizations. In terms of like the sequence, I think, a lot of students come out of, undergraduate or graduate school, and they think, they just want to go to their final career goal right away. People come to me, they graduate, get a graduate degree, and then they come to me and want to join USTR. Well, USTR, for the most part, it doesn't hire people without work experience. And so what I tell people is, before you put in an application for USTR, try working at another government agency, like the Commerce Department or the International Trade Commission, for example, which tends to hire more entry-level people or more junior people, and then work your way up to USTR. I'm in a think tank now, and I have some people working for me on trade, and I've the last 3 people I've hired, they've gone on then to work for the government. So I think the key is to find a good job in the beginning if you can, and see where the opportunities are, and then kind of build your career towards where you want to go. But don't get a really big head and think you're qualified for jobs where people are looking for more experience. I think the U.S. government offers incredible opportunities for people. As I mentioned, I entered the government through the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. At that time, it was called the PMI program. I will say I ended up being with the government for over 30 years. That was not my career path. I thought I'd join the government for a few years, and I got such incredible responsibility at a relatively young age. And I just was having so much fun that I ended up staying with the government for a long time, but that was not my career path. I thought I'd get some experience with the government and then go on to the private sector. And so there's many, many jobs. And I think if you're in the Washington community, you get a sense that you can work for think tanks, you can work for trade associations, you can work for companies, you can work for embassies. I mean, there's just a lot of and consulting firms. There's just a lot of opportunities. And so, the importance of networking, keeping your options open, talking to professors, talking to friends, I think all of that really helps launch you in your career.
What do you think about the impact of Korea's recent boycott movement against Japanese products to the trade relationship between Korea and Japan?
It pains me to see actions taken against, between the two countries. I really think it's important for Japan and Korea to look forward, to be forward-looking, and I get it. There's a lot of historical stuff, and no one's going to change that. But I think we're really at a time in the world where we can't afford for Japan and Korea to be in a dispute. I think that there are a lot of things there's a lot of commonalities between Japan and Korea, and particularly with the rising China and with the North Korea situation. It just pains me to see Japanese and Koreans taking actions against each other, including in the trade space, but by no means limited to trade.
I would love to get your thoughts on whether you think the Trump administration has fundamentally altered our relations with trading partners, which will complicate, make more difficult to conduct potential future bilateral or multilateral trade agreements.
That's a great question. I mean, I think clearly over the past 4 years, we have caused a lot of our allies and partners and also adversaries a lot of grief. But particularly when it comes to our allies and partners, we've treated them, I think, in a way that, really needs to be repaired and turned around. And as a result, even if Vice President Biden wins, and he's put a lot of emphasis on trying to repair relationships and reset relationships with allies and partners, I think this is going to take us a bit of time. I think we're going to need to rebuild trust, particularly with our allies and friends, and really show them that we value them and that we're sincere about wanting to work with them towards reaching solutions. Now, I caution everyone when we talk about working with allies and partners, I don't think this is the panacea of, and that this is going to, mean that we're going to be successful with our China policy, or it's going to, we'll be able to combat climate change just by that alone. I mean, again, what I said earlier, I really believe that all of these issues require multifaceted approaches, but clearly a collective approach is important. But when I look at, for example, like working with allies and partners vis-a-vis China, I think it's a bit complicated, right? Because let's be honest, and particularly most of the Asian countries, who's their largest trading partner? It's not the United States, it's China. And again, what I mentioned earlier, the Chinese market, the Chinese economy will probably grow by at least 2% this year, while the rest of the economies, advanced economies, will be shrinking this year. And so when you look where the dynamism is, where the growth is, it even makes countries even more interested in preserving their ties with China. And as a result, I think while we share many common concerns with allies and partners, we need to keep our expectations realistic about how far we can go working with other countries. I think there's a lot of ground we can cover with them and a lot of areas where they will want to work with us. But again, I think we'll find that maybe we have different levels of ambition or different approaches to prioritize. And we need to respect the other side and really listen to how far they're willing to go with us. So I think that's important as well. But again, just back to your question, I think rebuilding trust is going to be extremely important. I think it can be done. And conversations I have with a lot of my contacts in the region suggest that they really want the United States back. They want us to lead. They want us to be engaged. And so that's very positive. But it's not just a question of saying we're back. I think we're going to have to prove ourselves a bit about our genuine commitment to engagement and sustained engagement.
We have area studies and also a lot of functional concentrations that are available, like trade, technology, development. But you cannot do all of them at the same time. You should make a choice. So what would be your advice to a student who still have this big question and haven't decided what to do?
Yeah, I think in this day and age, just being a generalist doesn't work. Okay, I think you really need a specialty. And unfortunately now, and this differs when I went to school, like just knowing a language like Chinese, that's just not enough anymore. Like you need to know Chinese, but then you also need a functional specialty or a real regional specialty. And so I think that's important. But at the same time, I think looking ahead, many of the issues that are going to be on the plate, on the plate, whether it be climate change or trade, economic cooperation, technology. I think a lot of these issues also require a multidisciplinary perspective as well. And so on one hand, I'm telling you, I'm advising, find your specialty, but don't discount and still take classes to really if you're in the political side, take some economic classes so at least you understand the economic perspective, and vice versa, or security or environment. And so I think it's really a combination of being a specialist, but being able to see things in the bigger picture. And I think that puts a lot of burdens on students. I think it's a lot more difficult to be a student today than when I went to school, frankly, because there's so much competition, and there's so much, while there are a lot of career opportunities, there's just a lot of competition, and you're competing against a lot of other incredible students, not only from the United States, but all around the world these days.
Thank you so much for, taking your time, actually extra minutes to answer the questions.
Of course. Thank you so much. And I'm just really honored to be your inaugural guest on this program, which I know is going to be very successful. Thank you.
Thank you.